The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second seeming to drag on longer than the last. Marcus sat near the back of the classroom, his eyes half closed, struggling to keep his focus on the words scribbled on the board. It wasn't that he didn't care about the lesson, he had always been interested in math, but the way Mr. Richards taught made it hard to stay engaged. The teacher was one of those who loved to show off his superiority, and today, that attitude was in full force. "All right, class," Mr. Richards began, his voice full of self-importance. "I'm going to give you a challenge today. Let's see who can solve this equation. This one's not for the faint of heart." He turned around and scrawled a long, complicated series of numbers and symbols across the chalkboard. The equation was impossibly complex, full of variables and operations that most students had never even heard of. It was the kind of problem that looked more like a puzzle than anything anyone could realistically solve. Mr. Richards loved these moments. He thrived on being the expert, the one who knew things the students didn't. Marcus glanced up at the board, his mind already beginning to work through the equation. It wasn't that he was a genius or anything, he just had a knack for patterns, for seeing how numbers fit together. To him, the equation was a challenge, not something to be intimidated by. But when Mr. Richards turned back around, his eyes landed on Marcus, and a familiar sneer appeared on his face. "Marcus," Mr. Richards said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you think you can solve this? I'm not sure you're ready for something this complicated." The room fell silent. The students, most of whom had already started to whisper amongst themselves, now turned their attention to Marcus. Some exchanged glances, as if waiting for him to fail. Others already looked bored, as if they expected him to do just as badly as he always did in Mr. Richards' class. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was used to this. Mr. Richards had always been like this, mocking him, belittling him for being quiet, for being different. For being black. It wasn't something he liked to talk about, but he could feel the difference. It was in the way Mr. Richards' eyes narrowed when he looked at him. It was in the way the other students would laugh when the teacher would pick on him, as though they too thought he was the problem. But today, Marcus didn't feel like playing along. He was sick of being pushed around. "Well?" Mr. Richards pressed, waiting for a response. The room held its breath. Marcus took a deep breath, his fingers curling around the pencil in his hand. "I'll give it a shot," he said, his voice steady. Mr. Richards let out a mocking laugh. "You solve this equation?" He shook his head. "All right, if you're so confident, then go ahead. Let's see what you've got." Marcus could hear the sneer in his voice. It wasn't just the equation that Mr. Richards was mocking, it was him. Marcus knew that Mr. Richards thought he was too slow, too incompetent, to understand something like this. But there was something about the way Mr. Richards said it that made Marcus's resolve harden. "Don't mess this up," Sarah, his best friend, whispered from the row in front of him. She'd always had his back, even when no one else did. Marcus gave her a quick nod, grateful for her quiet encouragement. Sarah was the only one who ever really believed in him. With a glance at Mr. Richards, who was still smirking, Marcus began to write on his paper. The classroom felt strangely quiet as he worked, almost as if the world outside was waiting for him to make a mistake. But Marcus had always been a problem solver. He'd grown up figuring things out on his own, whether it was puzzles, video games, or math. Numbers didn't lie. There was always a solution, even to the most complicated problems. He started small, breaking down the equation into manageable parts. It wasn't easy, but it made sense. As he worked through it, his confidence began to grow. The more he solved, the clearer it became. The numbers weren't just random digits, they were like pieces of a puzzle, each one fitting neatly into the next. Meanwhile, Mr. Richards paced in the front of the room, waiting for Marcus to trip up. He loved moments like this, the chance to see a student fail. But Marcus wasn't failing. In fact, he was moving through the problem faster than Mr. Richards had expected. The class was watching him, some with interest, some with disbelief. A few students, like Sarah, seemed to be rooting for him, but most were waiting for the inevitable mistake. They all knew the story: Marcus was just another kid who would never measure up. "Mr. Richards," Marcus said quietly, raising his hand after a few minutes. "I think I've solved it." There was a pause in the room. The students all turned to look at Marcus, their faces a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Mr. Richards' smirk faltered for just a moment. "Really?" he said, almost sneering. "Let's see what you've got, Marcus." Marcus stood up slowly, trying to keep his calm, and walked up to the board. He felt the eyes of every student on him, but he didn't let it distract him. He wrote the solution out clearly, step by step. Each move was deliberate, precise, like he was completing a piece of art. When he finished, he turned to face Mr. Richards, who was staring at the board in stunned silence. The equation had been solved. Perfectly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, one of the students, a girl named Emma, whispered, "Did he just solve it?" Mr. Richards blinked, his face flushing. He turned to the class, trying to recover his composure. This can't be right," he muttered, but there was no denying it. The answer was correct. Marcus had done it. There was a stunned silence in the room. It wasn't just that Marcus had solved the equation, it was that he had done it so effortlessly, so confidently. Mr. Richards cleared his throat, trying to mask his embarrassment. "Well, I suppose you got lucky," he said, his voice now much less confident than before. "But this is far from over, Marcus. Don't think this means you can keep up." But Marcus wasn't listening anymore. He had done it. And now, he felt something else stirring inside him. It was the sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't what everyone thought he was. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Marcus thought, as he sat back down, his heart pounding. He wasn't going to let this moment pass by. This was just the beginning. And he was ready to prove it. Marcus leaned back in his seat, staring out the classroom window as the rest of the class settled into a buzz of chatter. The day's events replayed in his mind. He had solved the equation. It should have been a victory, but there was a strange feeling that lingered in the pit of his stomach, a mix of triumph and unease. It wasn't just the challenge from Mr. Richards. It was the feeling that nothing had really changed. Not yet, anyway. But in that brief moment when he'd solved the problem, when the room had fallen into stunned silence, Marcus had felt something different. It wasn't just the sense of proving Mr. Richards wrong. It was the realization that maybe, just maybe, he was capable of more than the world thought he was. That night, Marcus sat in the small kitchen of his apartment, the only light coming from the low hum of the refrigerator. His mother, Janine, was at the stove, humming a tune while she stirred something in a pot. It was always quiet here, just the two of them, ever since Marcus's father had walked out when he was 6. He didn't remember much about his dad, just that he'd left without a word, leaving them to struggle on their own. Janine had been both mother and father to Marcus, working long hours at a local diner to make ends meet. Despite the hard work, she always made sure Marcus knew that he was loved, that his potential wasn't defined by the circumstances they lived in. "How was school today, baby?" Janine asked, glancing over her shoulder with a warm smile. Her tired eyes were softened by years of constant worry, but there was always pride in them when she looked at her son. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain the day's events. He hadn't exactly told her about Mr. Richards' mockery, but she always seemed to sense when something wasn't quite right. "It was, okay," Marcus said, his voice betraying his true feelings. He scratched his head and added, "I solved the equation, though." Janine turned fully around, the spoon in her hand pausing midair. Her eyes widened in surprise, and a smile spread across her face. "You did what?" That's my boy. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the kitchen to hug him tightly. I knew you had it in you. I've always known. Marcus hugged her back, feeling the warmth of her embrace. She was the one person who never doubted him. Still, part of him wanted to say more. To tell her about the sneers, the mocking, the way Mr. Richards had treated him. But he couldn't bring himself to say it. What good would it do? His mother already had enough on her plate. I don't know, Mom, Marcus said, pulling away and sitting down at the table. Mr. Richards still doesn't think I'm smart enough. He keeps saying I'm not ready for stuff like that. He doesn't believe in me. Janine's expression softened. She walked over to the table, sitting across from him. People are gonna doubt you, Marcus. You have to understand that. Not everyone is gonna see you for who you are. Not everyone will see your worth. But you know what? That's not your problem. The only person who gets to decide who you are is you. Marcus nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. He had heard them before, many times, but today they felt different. It wasn't just about getting through the day, it was about something much bigger. Maybe he wasn't just fighting for a grade, or for respect from his teacher. Maybe, in a way, he was fighting for his own place in a world that constantly tried to tell him he didn't belong. The next day, Marcus walked home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He passed by the same street corner where the older kids hung out, the ones who liked to sit on the curb and talk about basketball, girls, and everything else. He had never quite fit in with them, but it didn't bother him much anymore. He'd learned to keep to himself, to focus on what mattered to him. Still, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation as he passed. Man, did you hear that Marcus kid solved that equation yesterday? Like, for real, one of the older boys said, his voice a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Yeah, but he's still just that weird kid who doesn't fit in, right? Doesn't mean anything. Marcus tried not to let their words sting. He had heard them all before, just the same things he'd heard from Mr. Richards. People underestimated him, judged him by his quiet demeanor and his skin color. It wasn't new. It was just exhausting. He quickened his pace, not wanting to linger too long in that space, in that world that seemed to want him to stay small. The street was quieter now, just the sound of his sneakers hitting the pavement. His thoughts wandered to the future, the way he'd have to work twice as hard to prove himself, to make people see him for who he really was. It wasn't just about math, it was about everything. He wanted to show the world that he wasn't a stereotype, that he was more than what they expected him to be. He reached the small, run-down apartment building he called home, climbing the stairs to their second-floor unit. When he entered, the smell of home-cooked food filled the air, his mother had already set the table for dinner, and the comforting sound of her singing along to the radio could be heard from the kitchen. Marcus felt a pang of guilt in his chest. His mom had always worked so hard for him, and he couldn't even share his victories with her fully. She was always so proud of him, but did she really know how hard things were for him? How many times he had been pushed aside, made to feel invisible. Maybe he would never be able to explain it fully to her, but he knew one thing for sure, he wouldn't let them define him. The next day at school, the air felt different. The hum of everyday chatter had taken on a slightly uneasy edge. Marcus could feel it as soon as he stepped into the classroom. His classmates were looking at him differently, some with awe, others with skepticism. He was no longer just the quiet kid at the back of the room, now, he was the kid who had defied Mr. Richards' expectations. But as he slid into his seat, he could feel the familiar weight of Mr. Richards' eyes on him, a sharp, scrutinizing gaze that lingered just a bit too long. It was the same look the teacher gave him whenever he got something right, like Marcus' success was something that needed to be monitored, corrected, or, in some cases, dismissed. "All right, class," Mr. Richards said, his voice cold and authoritative. "We're moving on to something new today. I hope you're all ready to keep up, especially those who seem to think they've got the answers to everything." His gaze flicked over Marcus, his words thick with thinly veiled disdain. Marcus swallowed the lump that formed in his throat. He wasn't sure why Mr. Richards had such a problem with him. Was it because of the way he looked? Was it because he had dared to challenge the teacher's authority by solving that impossible equation? He kept his head down, trying to ignore the tension building in the room. He knew today wouldn't be easy. The classroom felt different now, like the balance of power had shifted, and Marcus was suddenly under a spotlight that made him feel exposed. "Now, let's talk about the new lesson," Mr. Richards continued, his tone not quite as enthusiastic as it had been before. He began to write something complex on the board, an equation even more difficult than the one from yesterday. Marcus tried to ignore the tension growing inside him and focused on the math in front of him. This equation looked even more complicated than the last one, filled with unfamiliar symbols and operations. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. "Come on, let's see if you can get this one, Marcus," Mr. Richards said, his words almost a challenge. The whole class turned their eyes toward Marcus, their stares burning into him. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't respond. He refused to let Mr. Richards' words get to him. He had already proven something yesterday, and today, he wasn't going to back down. For the rest of the lesson, Marcus tried to focus on the problem at hand. As Mr. Richards went on explaining the intricacies of the equation, Marcus's mind whirred. He broke down the equation in his head, step by step. He knew he could solve this. It was just a matter of breaking it into smaller pieces. Mr. Richards paced back and forth in front of the classroom, his eyes occasionally flicking over Marcus. He seemed to be waiting for him to fail again. Marcus could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, and though they didn't say anything, the pressure was immense. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus raised his hand. "Mr. Richards, I think I've got it," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet confidence that surprised even him. The room fell into an eerie silence. Mr. Richards raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. He'd already written off Marcus as the kid who couldn't keep up. This wasn't supposed to be possible. But Marcus had done it once. Could he do it again? "Go ahead, Marcus," Mr. Richards said with an almost sarcastic edge. "Show us what you've got." Marcus stood, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. He didn't look at the students. He didn't look at Mr. Richards. Instead, he focused on the board, his mind working with practiced precision. He carefully began to write down the steps, explaining his reasoning out loud. As he worked through the equation, he could feel the eyes on him. The hum of whispers filled the room, but Marcus didn't let it distract him. He was in his zone, working through the problem with the same focus he had when he was younger, solving puzzles on his own at home. Numbers made sense to him. They didn't lie, and they didn't judge. When he finished, he turned around to face the class. His hands were slightly sweaty, but his heart was calm. "Done," he said quietly, his voice filling the room. The class sat in stunned silence. Mr. Richards blinked, his mouth slightly agape, as he scanned the equation on the board. It was right. Every step. Every calculation. For a moment, there was no sound. No whispers. Just the stillness of disbelief hanging in the air. How did you do that?" Mr. Richards stammered, his voice no longer laced with sarcasm, but with genuine confusion. Marcus stood tall, his eyes meeting Mr. Richards for the first time in what felt like forever. "I did what you said," he replied simply. "I solved it." The rest of the class passed by in a blur for Marcus. Though he had just proven himself yet again, the feeling of triumph from earlier had been quickly replaced with a new, unfamiliar tension. Mr. Richards wasn't just a teacher now, he was a rival. And there was something in the way he'd looked at Marcus after that second equation was solved, something that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. It was a look of contempt, not pride, as if Mr. Richards was frustrated that Marcus had outdone him. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Marcus grabbed his things quickly, eager to escape the charged atmosphere of the classroom. His classmates filtered out, some offering a quick congratulations, but it didn't feel right. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. In the hallways, Sarah caught up with him. She was grinning from ear to ear, but there was a trace of concern in her eyes. "That was incredible, Marcus," she said. "You shut him down, didn't you?" Mr. Richards looked like he couldn't believe it. Marcus sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Yeah, but something's off. I don't know what it is. He's not just mad that I solved the equation. It's like he's pissed that I'm even here. Like he wants to prove I don't belong." Sarah frowned. "I get that vibe too. But you know what? Don't let him get to you. You showed him what you're capable of. No one can take that away from you." Marcus managed a weak smile. She was right. He had done something important today, and he couldn't let Mr. Richards' bitterness stand in the way of his growth. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll try not to let it bother me," he said, though doubt still clouded his thoughts. The next week began with the usual routine. Marcus's heart pounded a little harder as he walked toward school, but it wasn't just the dread of another day with Mr. Richards. It was the growing realization that things were beginning to shift, both in the classroom and in the way he saw himself. The whole school was buzzing with talk about his accomplishments. Word had spread fast that Marcus had solved 2 impossible equations back to back. Some people were impressed, others were more skeptical. They weren't the ones Marcus worried about. It was Mr. Richards who still lingered in his thoughts, the teacher who had all but made it his personal mission to put Marcus in his place. As Marcus entered the school grounds, he could feel the difference. The stares were longer, the whispers more frequent. But the one thing that hadn't changed was that Marcus didn't fit in with any of the cliques. He wasn't part of the jocks, the nerds, or the popular crowd. He was just Marcus. But lately, even that felt like enough. That morning, when Marcus stepped into Mr. Richards's class, there was a palpable shift in the air. The students had returned to their seats, but they seemed almost more anxious than usual, like something was hanging over the room. Mr. Richards stood at the front of the classroom, his arms crossed, glaring at the students as if daring anyone to speak out of turn. "Take your seats, everyone," Mr. Richards said, his voice as cold as ever. "Today, we're tackling something that will really test your limits. I hope you're all ready. We'll be working with advanced calculus today." Advanced calculus? Marcus felt a ripple of nerves. It was one thing to solve simple equations or even the challenging ones from the other day. But advanced calculus? He hadn't expected Mr. Richards to throw him into something like that. He glanced at Sarah, who was sitting nearby, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and worry. "Don't sweat it," Sarah whispered, offering him a smile. "You've got this." Marcus nodded, but his heart was thumping. He knew this wasn't just about math anymore. It was about proving himself. Again. Mr. Richards started writing equations on the board, speaking in a low, monotonous voice as he explained the new material. The words blurred together, and Marcus could feel himself getting lost in the complexity. The room seemed to close in on him. The sounds of his classmates scribbling furiously filled the air, but Marcus's mind was racing. Was he really up for this challenge? He looked at the board, trying to make sense of the numbers, but it felt like the ground was slipping out from under him. This was a different kind of challenge. And Marcus wasn't sure if he was ready for it. By the time Mr. Richards announced the end of the lesson, Marcus felt defeated. He hadn't been able to fully grasp the material. The advanced calculus was too much, too soon. While the rest of the class was working through practice problems, Marcus just stared at his paper, his mind still spinning. How could he be so good at solving equations one day, only to stumble on something seemingly more straightforward the next? Mr. Richards paced the room, stopping to look over students' work. When he got to Marcus's desk, he stopped for a long moment. Marcus could feel his teacher's eyes boring into him, the familiar contempt now tinged with something else, disappointment. "Marcus," Mr. Richards said coldly, "it looks like you're struggling today. I expected more from you. After all, solving a few equations doesn't mean you're ready for the real challenge." Marcus's chest tightened. He had barely even started to solve the first problem. The confidence he had felt the previous week, when he had been unstoppable, seemed to evaporate. Was he really not cut out for this? The doubt crept in, gnawing at him. "Try harder next time," Mr. Richards muttered, before walking away. Sarah gave him a concerned glance but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Marcus knew exactly what she was thinking. But the thing was, she didn't understand what it felt like to always be under that microscope, to have to prove yourself time and time again. No matter how much he wanted to rise above it, the weight of expectations kept pulling him down. After school, Marcus found himself walking home in a daze. His mind was scattered with thoughts of calculus and equations that didn't seem to make sense. He had failed today. There was no denying it. The city streets were busy as usual, the sound of honking horns and chattering voices filling the air. But Marcus couldn't focus on anything except the nagging sense of disappointment in his chest. When he reached home, he didn't even bother to take off his shoes. He went straight to his room and collapsed onto his bed, staring up at the ceiling. His mother was working late again, so it was just him. No one to talk to. No one to remind him that he wasn't defined by a single failure. For the first time in a while, he felt completely alone. As Marcus sat there in the stillness of his room, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "You okay? You seemed off today. Don't let Richards get to you. He's just trying to knock you down. You're smarter than him, Marcus." Marcus stared at the screen for a moment. He wanted to text back, to tell Sarah everything, the doubt, the disappointment, the crushing feeling of failure. But he didn't. Instead, he typed back, "I'll be fine. Just need to figure this out. I'll talk to you tomorrow." He placed the phone down on his desk and went over to his small bookshelf, pulling out his notebook from last week. He flipped through the pages, finding the equations he had solved, the ones that had felt like small victories. Maybe they weren't just flukes. Maybe he was capable of more than he gave himself credit for. But why did he feel like an imposter? Was he really as smart as everyone said? Or was he just getting lucky? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Janine's familiar voice called out from the living room. "Marcus. You home?" Marcus stood up, not sure what to say. He didn't want to worry her. She had enough on her plate already. But as he walked into the living room, he saw her standing there, apron still on, her tired eyes searching his face. "How was your day, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Marcus forced a smile. "It was okay, Mom. Just a lot of math, you know." Janine walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know it's hard. But I believe in you. You've always found a way, Marcus. You'll figure it out, just like you always do." Her words hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, all the frustration, the uncertainty, and the exhaustion melted away. He wasn't alone. Not really. "Thanks, Mom," Marcus said quietly. "I just need to keep going." Janine smiled, squeezing his shoulder. "You've got this. I know you do." And for the first time that day, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he had lost today. Maybe Mr. Richards had been right to doubt him. But he wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not when he was this close. The days that followed were a blur of frustration and determination. Marcus spent hours each evening poring over his calculus textbook, the numbers and symbols dancing in his head. The feeling of defeat from that day with Mr. Richards lingered like a dark cloud, but it was also fueling something inside him, a fierce determination to prove himself. But no matter how hard he tried, the advanced calculus problems seemed insurmountable. Every time he thought he had made progress, he would hit a wall, unable to move forward. The more he struggled, the more doubts crept into his mind. Was he really smart? Or was it just a fluke that he had solved those equations before? As the weekend approached, Marcus's frustration grew. He found himself skipping meals, staying up too late, and even avoiding his friends. Sarah had texted him a few times, trying to check in, but he hadn't replied. What could he say? That he was struggling with something that should have been easy for him? That he was beginning to wonder if he had just been lucky? His mind was racing, his thoughts tangled and chaotic. He was no longer the kid who solved problems in an instant. Now, he was just a kid who couldn't even finish a single calculus problem. Monday arrived too quickly. As Marcus trudged into school, he felt the weight of his own failure pushing him down. He hadn't figured out the calculus problems yet. He wasn't sure if he even could. The upcoming test on the material was looming, and Marcus was terrified. When he entered Mr. Richards's class, the room felt colder than ever. Mr. Richards was already at the front of the room, organizing papers with a focused intensity. As the bell rang, he turned to face the class, his gaze landing on Marcus for just a split second. The contempt in his eyes was barely noticeable, but Marcus felt it like a slap. Today, we're having a quiz on the advanced calculus problems we've been working on, Mr. Richards announced, his voice cold and clinical. I hope you've all been studying. It's not going to be easy. The room was filled with a low murmur of anxiety as students began pulling out their pens and notebooks. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't feel ready. He didn't feel confident. And worst of all, he didn't feel like he belonged in this classroom. He was starting to wonder if Mr. Richards had been right all along, maybe he wasn't cut out for this after all. The quiz papers were handed out, and Marcus took his without a word. As he glanced down at the first problem, his stomach sank. The equations were even harder than what they had done in class. His mind went blank. He tried to focus, but the symbols seemed to swirl in front of his eyes, taunting him. He could feel the sweat gathering on his palms as he scribbled down a few tentative steps, but nothing felt right. For the next 30 minutes, Marcus struggled in silence. His pen moved mechanically across the page, but the answers didn't come. Every time he thought he had solved something, another part of the problem fell apart. His mind was in a fog, and the pressure was suffocating. Mr. Richards walked around the room, his footsteps clicking sharply on the tile floor. Every time he stopped by Marcus's desk, Marcus could feel his eyes on him, judging him. The weight of those stares was unbearable. Marcus wanted to raise his hand, to ask for help, but he knew that would be a sign of weakness. Mr. Richards would only see it as an admission of failure. And right now, Marcus couldn't afford to fail. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing second. Marcus felt trapped. The more time passed, the less hope he had of finishing the quiz. His head was spinning, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was disappointing everyone around him. Then, out of nowhere, the thought hit him like a lightning bolt: what if I'm just not cut out for this? The thought was so simple, yet so powerful. It paralyzed him. What if he wasn't meant to be the math genius everyone thought he was? What if he didn't deserve the praise? What if he had just gotten lucky the last time? But then, in the middle of his despair, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a voice in his head telling him to keep going. It was a memory. A simple memory of his younger self, sitting at his desk at home, the excitement of cracking a difficult puzzle that had been keeping him up for hours. The joy of figuring something out, of feeling like he had control over something in his life, something that made sense. That memory snapped him out of his spiral. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind clearing for just a moment. He picked up his pen again and started over, slowly but surely working through the problems in front of him. For the first time that day, the numbers made sense. The symbols fell into place. And in that moment, he realized something important: it wasn't about the outcome. It was about the process. He didn't need to solve everything perfectly. He just needed to keep trying. He needed to remember why he started this journey in the first place. The bell rang, signaling the end of the quiz. Marcus reluctantly put his pen down, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't sure if he had answered every question correctly. He wasn't sure if he had answered any of them correctly. But for the first time in days, he didn't feel defeated. He had fought through the doubt, the fear, and the pressure to finish. Mr. Richards collected the papers, giving Marcus one last, pointed glance. But Marcus didn't flinch. He had done his best. And that was enough. As the class filed out of the room, Sarah waited for him by the door. She gave him a sympathetic look, but also one of encouragement. "How did it go?" she asked softly. Marcus shrugged. "I'm not sure. But I finished it." Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that made Marcus feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this as he had thought. "That's all that matters," she said. "You didn't give up." The days after the quiz passed in a blur of mixed emotions. Marcus wasn't sure what to expect and the results came back, but he couldn't shake the nagging thought that he had failed. After all, how could he possibly have done well? He had barely managed to finish the quiz. Yet, there was something different about the way he viewed the challenge now. He had faced the pressure, the doubt, and had come out the other side still standing. That in itself felt like a small victory. Tuesday afternoon arrived, and Mr. Richards was distributing the graded quizzes. Marcus sat at his desk, tapping his pen nervously. He couldn't stop glancing at the papers being passed around the room, wondering if his own was going to be one of the last handed out. When Mr. Richards finally reached his desk, he placed the quiz in front of Marcus without a word. Marcus hesitated before flipping it over, his heart racing in his chest. For a moment, he thought about pretending he didn't care, but the truth was that he did care. He cared more than he'd like to admit. He flipped the paper over, and his eyes immediately went to the score at the top, 97%. Marcus couldn't believe it. The feeling that washed over him was indescribable. It was as if all the weight he had been carrying for weeks, doubt, fear, pressure, had been lifted in that single moment. His hands trembled slightly as he ran his eyes over the problems he had solved. He had missed a couple of small steps in the final two problems, but other than that, it was practically perfect. Mr. Richards didn't say anything, but his look as he passed by Marcus's desk spoke volumes. It wasn't a look of disappointment or mockery, but rather one of begrudging acknowledgement. He may not have said it out loud, but Marcus could feel the shift. He had proven himself, at least for today. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Marcus gathered his things quickly. He couldn't wait to get out of there. The adrenaline still buzzed in his veins, and he had a hard time wiping the smile off his face. As he walked to the door, Sarah caught up with him, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. Marcus couldn't help but grin. "I did. 97%. Mr. Richards looked. "I don't know," surprised. Sarah's eyes widened. "No way. That's awesome, Marcus." He laughed, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Yeah, I guess I've been holding my breath for nothing." They stepped outside together, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the school. Marcus felt the warmth on his face and realized that, for the first time in a long time, he was excited about something. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. "Do you want to study for the next one together?" Sarah asked, glancing at him. Marcus thought for a moment. He could feel the pull of his old habit, the tendency to isolate himself when things got tough. But then he thought about the relief he felt after talking to Sarah, after having someone believe in him. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face everything alone. "Yeah, that sounds good," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do it." As they walked to the bus stop together, the air seemed a little less heavy, the world a little more welcoming. Marcus realized that the real victory wasn't in the grade, it was in finally realizing that he didn't have to fight alone. There was help, there was support, and maybe, just maybe, he had more strength than he'd given himself credit for. That evening, Marcus sat at his desk with his calculus textbook open in front of him, but it was different now. He wasn't just studying because he had to. He was studying because he wanted to understand it. The numbers on the page no longer felt like an enemy. They were a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to be met. He worked through several problems, the familiar thrill of solving each one rushing through him. And when he made a mistake, he didn't panic. He just corrected it and moved on. His mother called up to him from downstairs, asking if he was coming for dinner, but Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was lost in the flow, in the rhythm of his thoughts. The equations were no longer a barrier, they were an opportunity. After a while, he looked up from his work and realized how much time had passed. He quickly grabbed his jacket and went downstairs, realizing for the first time that maybe he could balance his love for math with everything else in his life. At dinner, his mom mentioned something casually, almost as if she hadn't noticed, "You've been spending more time on your schoolwork lately. How's everything going? Are you feeling better about it?" Marcus paused, a small smile creeping onto his face. "Yeah, Mom. I think I'm starting to get it. I'm figuring it out." She raised an eyebrow but smiled, pleased to see him so focused. "That's great, Marcus. I'm proud of you." For the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel like he was pretending to be okay. He actually was okay. The next day at school, Marcus found that the tension in Mr. Richards's classroom had shifted, too. It wasn't that he had become Mr. Richards's favorite student, far from it. But something had changed. The teacher no longer looked at Marcus with disdain. Instead, there was a silent acknowledgement, a shift in the power dynamic. Marcus had done something Mr. Richards hadn't expected, he had proven himself. As the class began, Mr. Richards addressed the room in his usual way. But this time, when he glanced at Marcus, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. It wasn't approval, exactly, but it wasn't contempt either. It was almost as if he had recognized Marcus as a force to be reckoned with. That recognition, however small, made all the difference. Marcus didn't feel like the outsider anymore. He felt seen, even if just by one person. And that was all he needed. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself settling into a routine. School was still challenging, but the weight of doubt that had burdened him before seemed to lift little by little. He was learning how to balance the pressure of expectations with the joy of discovering new things in his classes. Yet, while his relationship with his schoolwork was improving, there was one person he hadn't fully reckoned with, Mr. Richards. Even though Marcus had passed the quiz and demonstrated that he could keep up with the class, Mr. Richards still didn't seem entirely convinced. The teacher's usual sharp eyes followed Marcus closely, always watching, always waiting. It was as if there was some lingering doubt in Mr. Richards's mind about Marcus's true abilities. And Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the teacher still considered him an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the advanced class. One chilly morning in November, Marcus found himself staring at a new set of calculus problems that Mr. Richards had written on the board. The class was buzzing with anxiety, as everyone knew this was going to be the test problem for the week, a problem so challenging it could break a student's spirit if they weren't prepared. Mr. Richards stood by the board, arms crossed, watching the students as they scribbled furiously in their notebooks. His gaze was sharp, and it swept over the room like a hawk looking for prey. When his eyes landed on Marcus, there was a flicker of something in them, a challenge, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. Either way, Marcus could feel it. It made his stomach twist. As Marcus attempted the problem, he quickly realized that it was unlike anything he had faced before. The numbers and symbols seemed to taunt him, and every attempt to get through the problem only led him down a dead-end road. The pressure was mounting. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, the weight of Mr. Richards's gaze like a silent judgment hovering over him. Just as Marcus felt the panic start to take over, Sarah, who was sitting next to him, leaned over and whispered, "You've got this. Take a step back and look at it from a different angle." Her voice was soft but encouraging, and it struck Marcus like a lifeline thrown to someone who was drowning. He took a deep breath, trying to push aside the mounting anxiety. Sarah's words had given him a moment of clarity. This wasn't just about solving the equation, it was about figuring out how to approach it. Like a puzzle. A challenge that required patience. Marcus started again. He broke the problem down into smaller pieces and approached each part methodically. Slowly but surely, the problem began to make sense. He worked through the algebraic manipulations, and the calculus formulas that once felt overwhelming started to align in his mind. The path forward became clearer, and Marcus's heart began to race as he approached the final steps. Within minutes, Marcus had the answer. But it wasn't just any answer, it was the correct one. He had solved the most difficult problem in the set, and the realization hit him like a sudden burst of energy. When Marcus looked up, he caught Mr. Richards's eye. For a moment, there was a silence. Mr. Richards seemed to hesitate, his lips tightening slightly. The teacher's face was unreadable, but for the first time, Marcus could see the flicker of something else, respect. Mr. Richards nodded, almost imperceptibly, and then moved on, but that small gesture sent a shockwave through Marcus. It wasn't approval in the traditional sense, but it was something. The teacher had acknowledged his ability, even if it was just a flicker of recognition. And that was enough. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat at lunch with Sarah. The cafeteria was noisy, filled with the chatter of students, but Marcus barely noticed. He was too focused on the moment in Mr. Richards's class. "Sarah," he said, looking across the table at her, "I think Mr. Richards, he noticed something today. He didn't say anything, but I think he finally sees that I can do it." Sarah grinned. "I told you. You just had to trust yourself." Marcus smiled back, feeling a mix of relief and excitement. "I didn't think I could do it. I kept doubting myself, but I think today I finally believed in myself again." "That's what it's all about," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've got the brains, Marcus. Now you just have to trust them. And remember, I'm always here if you need help." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward Sarah. She had been there for him when he needed it the most. He wasn't sure he would have made it through that rough patch without her support. "You're a good friend, Sarah. I don't think I tell you that enough." She shrugged, her smile playful. "You don't have to. I know you've got my back, just like I've got yours." The rest of the day passed by quickly. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the calculus problem and how everything had clicked into place. He was beginning to see that the road ahead was not going to be easy, but it was going to be worth it. He was ready for the challenges, no matter how difficult they might be. The next morning, something completely unexpected happened. The rest of the class filed out, leaving Marcus standing at his desk, heart pounding in his chest. What was this about? He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? When the classroom was empty, Mr. Richards walked over to Marcus's desk. He looked at Marcus with a calculating expression, and for the first time, Marcus couldn't read his face. "I want to apologize," Mr. Richards said, surprising Marcus with his words. "I've been hard on you, maybe harder than I should have been. But the truth is, I've seen something in you, something I didn't fully recognize at first. You have potential, Marcus. Real potential." Marcus blinked, not entirely sure if he had heard that correctly. Mr. Richards, the teacher who had mocked him in the past, was apologizing. "I'd like you to help me with the upcoming tutoring sessions," Mr. Richards continued. "There are a few students struggling with the same material you've excelled at. I believe you could offer them valuable insights." Marcus was stunned. He had never expected Mr. Richards to give him this kind of opportunity. But deep down, he knew it was the chance he had been waiting for, to prove not just to Mr. Richards, but to himself, that he could not only be a student, but also a mentor. "Of course," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'd be happy to." Mr. Richards nodded. "Good. I'll have more details for you later this week. And Marcus," he paused, his eyes meeting Marcus's, "you're doing well. Keep it up." As Marcus left the classroom, the weight that had been hanging over him seemed to lift for good. Not only had he earned Mr. Richards's respect, but he had also been given a chance to help others, something he never imagined would happen. Marcus's newfound confidence started to feel like a double-edged sword. While it was empowering to believe in himself and take on new challenges, it also meant more was expected of him. The tutoring sessions with Mr. Richards went well at first, and Marcus enjoyed helping other students who were struggling. He found a sense of purpose in being able to share his knowledge and guide others, but as time went on, the pressure began to mount. The tutoring sessions were held after school every Tuesday and Thursday. Marcus would stay in the classroom for an extra hour, helping a few of his classmates with problems they found difficult to understand. He'd go through the steps slowly, explaining each concept clearly. Most of the students appreciated his help, and their grades started improving. But there was something Marcus didn't expect. The more he helped others, the more he realized how much he himself still had to learn. The material in class was becoming harder, and the tests were getting tougher. As he spent more time teaching, he found that he was falling behind in his own studies. The assignments piled up, and the quizzes became increasingly difficult. It wasn't just the math that was weighing on him. As his classmates started to depend on him more, he felt an unspoken responsibility to keep up his perfect image, both as a student and a tutor. He started to feel like he was on a tightrope, trying to balance helping others while not falling behind in his own coursework. The pressure made it hard to focus. When Marcus sat down to study on his own, his mind would wander, consumed with the thought of his tutoring sessions and whether or not his classmates were understanding the material. He found himself going over things twice, or even 3 times, just to make sure he didn't make any mistakes. One Thursday afternoon, after the tutoring session ended, Marcus was walking home with Sarah. She could tell something was off by the look on his face. He had been quiet for most of the walk, and his usual confident stride was replaced by a slow, deliberate pace. "Hey, what's wrong?" she asked, concerned. "You've been kind of off lately." Marcus let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I feel like I'm falling behind. I'm helping others, but I can't keep up with my own work. The quizzes are getting harder, and I'm starting to feel like I'm not as good at this as I thought I was." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. "Marcus, you're doing amazing. You've been helping everyone in class, and your grades are still up. You just need to take a step back and breathe. You can't do it all at once." But Marcus shook his head. "That's just it. I'm supposed to be the one with all the answers. I'm the one who's supposed to help everyone else. But what if I'm not cut out for this? What if I fail them?" Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, making him stop. "You don't have to be perfect, Marcus. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to ask for help, too." Marcus felt the weight of her words, but it didn't make the pressure go away. He wanted so badly to prove that he belonged in the advanced class, that he was worthy of being the one who helped others. But in doing so, he was neglecting his own needs, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. The following week, Marcus found himself overwhelmed. His calculus test was coming up, and his other classes were demanding his attention too. Between his schoolwork and tutoring, he barely had time to eat or sleep. He felt like he was drowning in expectations. On the day before the test, Marcus stayed late at school, poring over the material. He could barely keep his eyes open as he scribbled down equations on his notebook. He was so focused on memorizing the formulas that he forgot to check in with himself. His stomach growled from hunger, and his head pounded with exhaustion. But he kept going, determined to prove to everyone, and to himself, that he could handle it all. It was only when Sarah walked into the classroom that evening, a worried expression on her face, that Marcus realized how much he had been neglecting himself. "Marcus, you need to stop. You've been at this for hours, and you're clearly burned out," she said, her tone firm but caring. Marcus didn't look up. "I can't stop now. I have to get this right. I have to." "Why?" Sarah asked, crossing her arms. "You're doing great, but this isn't worth sacrificing your health for." "I don't know what else to do," Marcus muttered. "I'm not good enough yet. If I don't pass this test, everything will fall apart." Sarah stepped forward, gently pulling the notebook out of Marcus's hands. "Listen to me. You're not alone in this. You don't have to carry all of this on your own. It's okay to ask for help. You don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to solve everything right away." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so focused on proving his worth to everyone else that he forgot to take care of himself. Sarah's words broke through the fog of stress and fear that had clouded his mind. That night, Marcus did something he hadn't done in a long time. He put away his books and took a break. He went home, had dinner with his mom, and got a full night's sleep. The next morning, he woke up feeling surprisingly refreshed. He wasn't sure what to expect from the test, but for the first time in days, he felt like he was in control again. As the test began, Marcus approached it with a calm focus he hadn't had in weeks. Instead of rushing through the questions, he took his time. He thought carefully about each problem and didn't let the pressure get to him. It wasn't about perfection, it was about doing his best, and that was enough. When the test ended, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew he had given it his all, and that was something to be proud of, no matter the result. The following week, the results came in. Marcus sat at his desk, anxiously awaiting his grade. When Mr. Richards finally handed back the tests, Marcus took a deep breath and flipped the paper over. 95%. He blinked, unsure of what he was seeing. He had expected a much lower score, given how stressed he had been leading up to the test. But this was a victory. He looked up at Mr. Richards, who seemed to notice his surprise. The teacher gave him a small nod, and for the first time, Marcus saw something in Mr. Richards's eyes, genuine acknowledgement. As Marcus walked out of the classroom, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had done it. He had found the balance he needed, not just in his schoolwork, but in his life. The weeks following Marcus's success on the calculus test were some of the most challenging of his life. While he had managed to find some balance, the pressure never quite went away. If anything, it only grew stronger. His classmates, especially those he tutored, now had even higher expectations of him. They were looking to him for guidance and answers, and Marcus felt both honored and overwhelmed. As the semester progressed, Marcus found himself in more tutoring sessions than ever before. The students he helped were improving, but there were moments when the pressure to keep up with his own coursework made it feel like he was juggling too many things at once. Every time he helped someone else, it took a little more out of him, and soon, his own assignments started to feel like a mountain he couldn't climb. One Tuesday afternoon, after staying up late to help a few students with their assignments, Marcus walked into Mr. Richards's class, only to be greeted with more advanced material. "Marcus," Mr. Richards said, eyeing him carefully as he entered the room, "I've noticed that you've been doing exceptionally well recently. I think it's time to take on a bigger challenge. I want you to lead the study group for this week's final review session." The words hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. He hadn't expected that. Leading the study group was no small task. He'd have to explain complex concepts, answer questions, and make sure everyone was on the same page. As much as he wanted to prove he could handle it, the idea of taking on even more responsibility made his stomach turn. He looked at Mr. Richards, unsure of what to say. "I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You're ready," Mr. Richards replied, his tone serious. "You've got the skills, Marcus. You just need to trust yourself." That evening, Marcus was back in the library, surrounded by books and notes for the upcoming review session. His phone buzzed, and it was a message from Sarah. "Hey, are you okay? You've been acting a little off lately." Marcus stared at the message for a moment, then typed back quickly. "I'm fine. Just a lot going on." He didn't want to admit how stressed he was. How could he? Everyone around him thought he had it all figured out. But the truth was, the more responsibility he took on, the more he felt like he was losing control. The study session loomed over him like a dark cloud, and Marcus wasn't sure if he could rise to the challenge. As the days passed, the anxiety continued to grow. He wasn't just worrying about the review session, he was worrying about his grades, his relationships with his classmates, and whether he would ever be able to meet the expectations everyone had of him. The more he tried to do, the less he felt like he could accomplish. It was an exhausting cycle, and Marcus could feel himself starting to crack under the pressure. The day of the study session arrived. Marcus stood in front of a group of students in the classroom, his heart racing. He had prepared all night, reviewing every possible scenario and question that might come up. But as he looked around the room, he could feel the weight of their eyes on him. They were all waiting for him to lead them through the material. "Okay," Marcus began, his voice a little shaky, "let's get started." He spent the next hour going over equations, explaining theories, and answering questions. But the more he talked, the more he realized something: he wasn't as sure of himself as he had thought. He stumbled through a few explanations, and when a student asked a question he didn't immediately know the answer to, he felt his confidence waver. The room grew quiet as Marcus fumbled with the concepts. He could feel the tension in the air, and it was starting to make him panic. One of the students raised their hand. "Marcus, I don't understand. Can you explain this part again?" Marcus blinked, struggling to find the words. His mind was a blur of confusion. Sure. Let me try again," he stammered. But nothing came out the way he intended. His explanation sounded jumbled, and the students' confused expressions made it clear that they weren't getting it. A sharp sting of frustration shot through Marcus, and he suddenly felt incredibly small. The pressure had reached its breaking point. How could he lead this session if he didn't even have the answers? How could he be the one everyone relied on if he couldn't even keep it together? After the study session ended, Marcus rushed out of the room. His mind was spinning, and he couldn't shake the feeling of failure. He had tried so hard, but it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. As he walked down the hall, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Sarah. "You okay? I saw how that session went. It's not the end of the world." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he stared at the message. He wanted to tell her everything: the pressure, the anxiety, how he had just felt like a fraud in front of the students. But he couldn't bring himself to type it out. Instead, he pushed his phone back into his pocket and kept walking. His head was spinning, and he didn't know where to go or what to do. The weight of expectations was crushing him, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending he had it all together. The next day, Marcus arrived at school early, trying to shake off the sense of defeat that lingered in the pit of his stomach. He had hoped that when he walked into Mr. Richards's class, the teacher wouldn't notice anything. But as soon as he sat down, Mr. Richards was there, watching him carefully. "Marcus," Mr. Richards said, his voice soft but firm, "I need to talk to you." Marcus felt his stomach churn. He braced himself for what was coming. "How did the study session go?" Mr. Richards asked, his eyes narrowing in concern. It was rough," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm cut out for this. I couldn't explain things clearly, and I feel like I let everyone down." Mr. Richards studied him for a moment before sitting down beside him. "Marcus, listen to me. You can't be everything to everyone. You can't always have the right answers, and that's okay. What matters is that you keep trying and that you don't give up. It's okay to fail sometimes, that's how we learn." Marcus nodded slowly, his heart heavy. It felt good to hear those words, but it didn't erase the pressure he still felt. "I just don't know how to handle all of it. The tutoring, the tests, everything." Mr. Richards looked at him with a mixture of understanding and wisdom. "It's a lot to carry, Marcus. And I know it feels like a lot of pressure, but you don't have to carry it alone. Let others help you, and don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. That's what it means to grow." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a small spark of hope. It was a fragile thing, buried beneath layers of stress and self-doubt, but it was there. He was beginning to understand that it was okay to ask for help, that he didn't have to shoulder the weight of everyone's expectations alone. The pressure had not gone away, but he was learning how to manage it, slowly, step by step. The week after the failed study session, Marcus made a conscious decision to take a step back. He wasn't going to try to be everything for everyone anymore. He would still tutor his classmates, still help them when they asked, but he was no longer going to let that be the only thing that defined him. He had to prioritize himself first. When Mr. Richards asked if he was willing to lead the next study group, Marcus hesitated. He could feel the familiar tension building in his chest. But this time, he didn't immediately say yes. Instead, he thought about it carefully. He didn't have to take on every responsibility all at once. He could ask for help, delegate some tasks, and work with others. "I'll lead the group, but I think we could use a second leader," Marcus said, looking Mr. Richards in the eye. Mr. Richards raised an eyebrow. "A second leader?" "Yeah. Someone to take some of the load off me," Marcus explained. "I've been feeling a little overwhelmed lately, and I think it would help if we split things up." Mr. Richards studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I admire your honesty, Marcus. That's a smart move. You don't have to do it all by yourself. Let me know who you'd like to work with." That night, Marcus called Sarah and told her about his decision. She was, as always, supportive. "I'm really proud of you, Marcus. It takes a lot of courage to ask for help, especially when you've been doing so much for others. I've learned the hard way that I can't do it all. I need to take care of myself too," Marcus admitted. "I don't want to burn out again." "I get it," Sarah said. "But don't forget, you're allowed to need help. And it doesn't make you weak. You're still amazing, no matter what." Her words brought a sense of warmth to Marcus's heart. She was right. He was still amazing, even if he wasn't perfect. It was okay to struggle. It was okay to admit that he couldn't do it all on his own. As Marcus lay in bed that night, he thought about what Sarah had said. He realized that he had been afraid of appearing weak. He didn't want people to think he wasn't capable, but now he understood that being vulnerable and asking for help was not a sign of weakness, it was a sign of strength. The next study group session went far better than the last one. Marcus had asked Sarah to help co-lead, and they worked together seamlessly. While Marcus focused on the more complex problems, Sarah handled the simpler concepts, helping students grasp the fundamentals before diving into the harder material. Together, they created an atmosphere of collaboration rather than pressure. The students responded well to their new approach. There was less tension in the room, and everyone seemed more engaged. Instead of feeling like they were there to impress Marcus, they felt like they were all in it together, working as a team to succeed. Marcus found himself enjoying the session for the first time in weeks. Afterward, Mr. Richards congratulated Marcus on his leadership. "You did well," he said. "Not just because you handled the material, but because you recognized when you needed help. That's a mark of true leadership." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had to do it all alone. He could rely on others, and they could rely on him. The next few weeks were challenging, but Marcus felt more equipped to handle them. He kept up with his studies, continued tutoring, and even started to enjoy the process. The constant pressure didn't go away, but he had learned how to manage it. He knew that he didn't have to bear the burden alone, and that made all the difference. One evening, as he sat in his room, Marcus reflected on everything he had gone through. From the moment Mr. Richards had doubted his abilities to the stress of tutoring, to the breakdowns and moments of clarity, it had all led him to this point. He had learned that failure wasn't the end. It was just a part of the journey, a stepping stone toward growth. It wasn't just about solving complex equations or leading study sessions. It was about learning who he was, what he could handle, and when to ask for help. It was about understanding that he didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to be everything to everyone. As he thought about all the challenges ahead, Marcus felt a sense of peace. There would be more tests, more difficult moments, but he was no longer afraid of them. He had the tools he needed to face them, tools like self-awareness, humility, and the ability to lean on others when needed. The following week, something unexpected happened. Marcus was sitting in the library, going over his notes for an upcoming test, when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello. Hi, is this Marcus?" a voice asked on the other end. "Yeah, this is Marcus." "Who's this?" "This is Coach Matthews from the school's basketball team. I heard you've been doing well in your studies and helping out with tutoring. I wanted to ask if you'd be interested in joining the team this season." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Basketball? He hadn't played in years, not since middle school. "Wait, are you sure you have the right person?" "I haven't played in ages." "Trust me," Coach Matthews said with a chuckle, "I know. But we need players with strong work ethics and the ability to think on their feet. You've got the skills. What do you say?" Marcus was stunned. He had always loved basketball, but after a few injuries and some tough experiences, he had given up on the idea of ever playing again. But now, after everything he'd gone through, after proving to himself that he could handle the pressure, he felt a strange sense of possibility. "I'll think about it," Marcus said, his voice hesitant but excited. "Take your time," Coach Matthews replied. "But I think you'd be a great addition to the team. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" Marcus stood in front of the basketball court that afternoon, the familiar scent of fresh wax and worn-out sneakers filling the air. His heart raced with uncertainty, and yet, there was a spark of excitement that he couldn't shake. He hadn't touched a basketball in nearly 3 years, but the offer from Coach Matthews had stuck with him. What if I'm not good enough anymore? He wondered. What if I embarrass myself? Despite the doubts swirling in his head, Marcus knew one thing for sure: he needed this. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about proving to himself that he could still take on challenges, even when they seemed outside his comfort zone. After Coach Matthews had made the offer, Marcus spent hours thinking about it. He could easily have said no, convinced himself that his time was better spent studying or tutoring. But something kept pulling him back to the idea of basketball. It wasn't just the sport, it was the challenge, the teamwork, and the sense of purpose that came with it. So, here he was, standing on the sidelines, ready to step onto the court for the first time in years. The sound of sneakers screeching against the hardwood floor and the basketballs bouncing echoed in his ears. His nerves were on overdrive, but he also couldn't ignore the rush of adrenaline that surged through him. Coach Matthews was nearby, watching as Marcus hesitated. "You good, Marcus?" he called out, his voice warm but encouraging. Marcus nodded, wiping his palms on his jeans. "Yeah, just, haven't played in a while." "You'll be fine," Coach reassured him. "You've got the mindset we need." With a deep breath, Marcus jogged toward the court. The team was already in the middle of a drill, but Coach Matthews waved him over. The moment Marcus touched the ball, he felt the familiar weight of it in his hands. It was almost like muscle memory kicked in. He dribbled the ball slowly at first, testing his limits. The ball bounced on the court beneath his feet with a steady rhythm. He could feel the tension in his legs, the lack of stamina that had built up over the years of inactivity. But as soon as he began moving, the old instincts came back. The way he pivoted, the way he set up his shot, it all felt just right. The other players watched with mild curiosity, and Coach Matthews gave a small approving nod. Good form. Keep it up. Marcus pushed himself harder, running the court, following through with his shots. As he did, a sense of confidence began to build inside him. Sure, he wasn't as fast as he used to be, and maybe his jump shots weren't as precise, but there was something exhilarating about being back on the court. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly testing himself again. However, as the practice continued, those familiar doubts crept back in. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding the team back. His passes were slightly off, and he found himself panting harder than he expected after every drill. His teammates, though polite, didn't seem to be relying on him much. Marcus couldn't help but wonder, was he just taking up space? Did they see him as a failure? At one point, as he attempted a layup, he missed the hoop entirely, causing the ball to bounce off the rim and roll away. A few of his teammates snickered. One of them, Derek, a senior on the team, shook his head. "You okay, rookie?" Derek asked, his tone not mean but dismissive. "Yeah," Marcus said quickly, trying to recover his composure. "I'm fine." But the sting of the comment lingered. Later that evening, as the team took a break to hydrate, Coach Matthews pulled Marcus aside. The older coach placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his expression serious but kind. "I know you're a little out of your element right now," Coach Matthews said, "but remember, it's not about perfection. It's about effort. You've got the mindset, Marcus. That's more than a lot of players have." Marcus glanced at the court, feeling a wave of gratitude toward his coach. "Thanks, coach. I just feel like I'm letting the team down. Like I don't belong here." "You belong," Coach Matthews said, his voice unwavering. "But you're going to have to fight through those doubts. No one walks onto a court and is perfect on day one. Hell, I wasn't great the first time I played. But I stuck with it, and I got better. You will, too. Just trust yourself." The following days on the court were tough. Marcus showed up early, stayed late, and worked tirelessly on his shooting, dribbling, and conditioning. But more than that, he worked on his mentality. He had to shut out the negative thoughts, the ones that told him he wasn't good enough, that he would never measure up to the expectations of his teammates. By the time the next practice rolled around, Marcus was more focused than he had been in a long time. He was still rusty, but he could feel himself improving. His shots were more accurate, his passes crisper. He even started running with more speed and agility, rediscovering his old rhythm. During a scrimmage, Marcus found himself in the right place at the right time. The ball was passed to him from the wing, and he took a quick shot at the basket. It felt like everything had slowed down, the ball left his fingertips with perfect form, heading straight for the hoop. Swish! The ball went through the net effortlessly. The gym erupted in applause, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt like he was on top of the world. He had done it, he had proven to himself that he still had the skills. He could still be the player he once was. Later that day, Coach Matthews called Marcus over again. He was smiling this time, his eyes filled with approval. "That shot you made during the scrimmage, that was exactly what I needed to see," Coach said. "You've got the potential to be a great player. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Marcus felt a wave of pride. He had finally done it. He had pushed through his doubts, worked harder than ever, and had proven himself on the court. It wasn't just the basket that meant something, it was the journey. He had fought his inner demons, challenged his insecurities, and come out the other side stronger. That evening, as Marcus walked home from practice, he couldn't help but think back on everything that had led him to this moment. He had started this journey as a student trying to live up to everyone's expectations. He had struggled under the weight of pressure, unsure of who he was or what he was capable of. But now, after facing his doubts head-on, he felt like he had learned something far more valuable than any grade or accolade. He had learned that growth wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about always succeeding, it was about fighting through the setbacks, the mistakes, and the failures. It was about the determination to keep going, even when things didn't go according to plan. Marcus smiled to himself as he reached his front door. No, he wasn't perfect. He was far from it. But that was okay. He was getting better every day. And that was all that mattered. The next few weeks felt like a blur for Marcus. School, basketball practice, and tutoring all seemed to collide in a whirlwind of deadlines, expectations, and self-imposed pressure. As much as he was excited to be playing basketball again, he couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind that kept reminding him of the looming tests, the study sessions, and his ongoing responsibilities. He was balancing so many things, and while he was doing well in some areas, it felt like he was barely holding it all together. Every morning, Marcus woke up with the feeling that the day would be the day he couldn't handle it all. The fatigue from basketball practice, combined with the pressure of tutoring in his academics, had begun to take its toll. He could feel his mind becoming scattered, jumping from one thing to the next without ever fully focusing on any one task. During school, he found it harder to concentrate. His notes were filled with half-finished thoughts, and he often found himself staring blankly at the board, not absorbing anything. He wanted to be present, wanted to succeed in every area of his life, but the demands were growing, and he couldn't keep up. As much as Marcus tried to hide it, he was starting to burn out. He didn't want to admit it to anyone, not his classmates, not even to Sarah. He had been so used to pushing through everything by himself that he was reluctant to admit that he was struggling. One day, during a particularly challenging physics lesson, Marcus found himself at his breaking point. His teacher, Mrs. Hopkins, was explaining the concept of electromagnetism, and for the third time in a row, Marcus realized that he hadn't understood a word. His thoughts were clouded by everything else, his basketball practice, the upcoming test, the tutoring group he was supposed to lead, and the deep sense of exhaustion that had been building over the past few weeks. Why can't I focus? He thought desperately. Why does everything feel so out of control? He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue, but it didn't help. His hand slid from his forehead to his notebook, where he had drawn random squiggly lines in the margins. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but Marcus didn't immediately pack up. He stayed seated, staring at his half-filled notebook, feeling a weight on his chest. Later that afternoon, Marcus was walking to the library when he ran into Coach Matthews in the hallway. The coach, ever observant, immediately noticed the change in Marcus's demeanor. "Everything okay, Marcus?" Coach asked, his tone gentle but direct. Marcus hesitated for a moment, not sure if he wanted to talk about it. But there was something about Coach Matthews's sincerity that made him feel like it was safe to be honest. I don't know. I'm having a hard time keeping up with everything," Marcus admitted, his voice quiet. "Basketball's been great, but I feel like I'm drowning in schoolwork. I can't keep up with the tutoring, and the stress from the test coming up is killing me." Coach Matthews nodded, understanding. "I can see that. And I've been watching you work hard on the court. But if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's important to take a step back and reevaluate things. You don't have to do it all at once, Marcus. You've got to prioritize." "But everything feels like it's equally important," Marcus said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I can't just drop one thing. If I do, I'll be letting people down." "You've got a lot on your plate, no doubt," Coach Matthews agreed. "But remember, Marcus, you don't have to carry that weight alone. It's okay to lean on others for support. You're a part of a team, not just in basketball, but in life. That includes your friends, your family, and even your classmates. Marcus wasn't sure what to make of Coach Matthews's advice at first. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on being the one people could rely on. But the idea of asking for help, of leaning on others, felt foreign to him. He had always seen it as a sign of weakness, a flaw he couldn't afford. But now, as the weight of everything started to crush him, he began to wonder if maybe he had it all wrong. The next day, Marcus took a moment to reflect on Coach's words. He started to realize that he wasn't alone in this. He had Sarah, who had been supportive through everything, even when he hadn't asked. He had his teammates, who had already shown that they had his back on the court. And he had classmates who, like him, were struggling to balance it all. Taking a deep breath, Marcus decided to talk to Sarah about what he had been going through. That evening, as they sat together at the coffee shop where they usually met to study, Marcus finally opened up. "I've been really struggling, Sarah," he said, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "I feel like I'm losing control. Between basketball, school, and tutoring, it's just too much. I'm barely hanging on, and I don't know what to do." Sarah looked at him with concern, but her expression softened. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Marcus, why didn't you say something sooner? You don't have to do everything by yourself." "I didn't want to let anyone down," he replied, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I thought if I asked for help, it would make me weak." Sarah shook her head. "Marcus, asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Everyone needs support sometimes. You don't have to be superhuman all the time." Marcus felt the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. Sarah's words were like a balm to his spirit, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a little lighter. With Sarah's encouragement, Marcus decided to reevaluate his approach. He couldn't continue to burn himself out trying to be perfect in every area of his life. He wasn't alone in his struggles, and it was okay to admit that he needed help. The first step was reaching out to his tutor group and asking if anyone else could step up and take on more responsibilities. To his surprise, several of his peers offered to help with organizing study sessions and even taking on some of the smaller tasks that Marcus had been handling. It felt like a weight was being lifted from his shoulders. The second step was rethinking his commitment to basketball. Coach Matthews had been right, he didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to play every minute or be the star player. He just needed to be part of the team and contribute where he could. That meant taking a step back during some practices and focusing on conditioning and teamwork rather than pushing himself to the limit every time. Marcus also realized that he needed to be kinder to himself. Not everything would go according to plan, and that was okay. He couldn't control everything, and sometimes, the best thing he could do was take a break and reset. As the days went on, Marcus began to find a rhythm. He balanced his studies, basketball, and tutoring more effectively, leaning on his team and friends when he needed support. The pressure didn't magically disappear, but he was learning how to handle it, one day at a time. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like he was making progress. He didn't have all the answers, and there were still plenty of challenges ahead, but he was no longer facing them alone. The following week, as Marcus settled into his routine of basketball, tutoring, and schoolwork, the pressure began to mount once again. The workload had increased, with 2 major projects coming due at the same time. On top of that, Coach Matthews had upped the intensity of practice in preparation for the first game of the season. Everything felt like it was building to a point of no return. Marcus was teetering on the edge, and he knew it. Marcus had spent the past few months trying to prove that he could handle it all. He'd been working overtime to stay ahead in his classes, to be a responsible tutor, and to maintain his position on the basketball team. But it wasn't enough anymore. He felt like he was trying to hold together too many fragile pieces at once, and the cracks were starting to show. In his history class, his grades had dipped slightly. He'd missed a couple of key study sessions because of practice, and the test results were a wake-up call that he couldn't juggle everything at once. He was running on fumes, tired, irritable, and barely able to focus. At basketball practice, his exhaustion was becoming evident. During drills, he was slower to react, his passes less accurate, and his shot was off. Coach Matthews, who had been encouraging him, now began to notice the difference. "Marcus, you okay out there?" Coach Matthews asked during a water break. "You don't look like yourself." Marcus forced a smile, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yeah, just a little tired," he replied, trying to downplay it. Coach Matthews wasn't fooled. "You need to take care of yourself. I can see you're pushing hard, but you're not gonna perform if you burn out before the game even starts." Marcus nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of everything else he had to manage. He was already overwhelmed, but he didn't want to disappoint Coach. He didn't want to seem weak in front of his teammates. "I'll be fine," he said, trying to sound convincing, but deep down, he knew he was anything but fine. That night, as Marcus sat in his room, surrounded by open textbooks and papers, he felt completely defeated. He had barely eaten all day and hadn't had time to relax or clear his mind. He looked at his to-do list, which seemed to be getting longer instead of shorter. Every time he crossed something off, another item seemed to pop up in its place. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "Hey, are we still on for dinner tomorrow?" Marcus stared at the message, a wave of guilt washing over him. He knew Sarah had been trying to support him, to be there when he needed someone to talk to, but he hadn't been able to make time for her. He texted back, "Sorry, I've got too much to do. I don't think I can make it." Immediately, he regretted it. Sarah was one of the few people who had been there for him through everything, and now he was pushing her away. He had been so focused on keeping up with everything that he had forgotten what really mattered, the relationships that kept him grounded. He set his phone down and closed his eyes, letting out a deep sigh. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. He wasn't just overwhelmed, he was afraid he was losing control. His balance was slipping, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending everything was okay. The next day, Marcus woke up late. He'd slept through his alarm, the result of a restless night filled with anxiety and stress. His heart sank as he realized he was already running behind. He rushed through his morning routine, skipping breakfast and throwing on his clothes in a hurry. At school, things didn't improve. In class, he struggled to stay focused. He had an upcoming test in biology, but when he tried to study during lunch, he could barely concentrate. The words on the page blurred together. He felt a growing sense of panic, a realization that no matter how hard he tried, he wasn't going to be able to get everything done. By the time basketball practice rolled around that afternoon, Marcus was barely hanging on. His mind was elsewhere, his body sluggish. He stumbled through the drills, missing shots he would have easily made just a few weeks ago. When Coach Matthews called him over for a break, Marcus could barely meet his eyes. "Hey," Coach said, his voice soft but serious. "You're not yourself today. What's going on?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so tired. I can't keep up with everything, Coach. I'm failing." The words came out before he could stop them, and the floodgates opened. Coach Matthews didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his expression softening with understanding. "Hey, Marcus," he said finally. "Listen to me. You're doing your best, and that's enough. But you don't have to do it all alone. You need to give yourself permission to rest. No one expects you to be perfect. Not me, not your teammates, and definitely not Sarah." For the first time, Marcus let himself feel vulnerable in front of someone. The weight of everything, his responsibilities, his expectations, his fears, had been too much for him to carry alone. He had tried to do it all, but now he realized that he didn't have to. Coach Matthews placed a hand on his shoulder, offering the kind of reassurance Marcus had been craving. "You're not a failure, Marcus. You're just human. And humans need rest. Humans need support." After practice, Marcus took Coach's advice to heart. He called Sarah and apologized for pushing her away. She was understanding, as always, and they made plans to meet up the following evening. It wasn't going to fix everything, but it was a start. That night, Marcus decided to take a step back. He made a list of everything he needed to do, but this time, he didn't push himself to finish it all in one night. He recognized that there was no shame in asking for help or in not having everything figured out. He reached out to his classmates for assistance with his biology study session, asking if anyone could help him review the material for the upcoming test. At basketball practice the next day, Marcus focused on what he could do, working on his conditioning, supporting his teammates, and doing his best without trying to be perfect. The game was coming up, and he wanted to be ready, but he didn't need to do it alone. By the time the weekend came, Marcus felt a renewed sense of clarity. He had been so focused on being perfect, on being the best at everything, that he had forgotten the most important thing: he needed to take care of himself first. The next few days were a test of Marcus's ability to pace himself. He learned to take breaks, to ask for help, and to let go of the unrealistic expectations he had set for himself. There would still be challenges ahead, but he was no longer trying to carry them alone. With each small victory, Marcus felt his confidence returning. He wasn't perfect, but he was learning. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. It was finally the week of the big game, and Marcus could feel the excitement in the air. The whole school was buzzing with anticipation. For the first time in a long while, he was beginning to feel a sense of balance. He had spent the past few days carefully managing his time, pacing himself with both his academic responsibilities and basketball commitments. It hadn't been easy, but the pressure was starting to feel more manageable. As the days drew closer to the game, Marcus began to feel the weight of the moment. He had always dreamed of playing in a game that mattered, something big, something that could make a difference. This was it. This game was more than just a typical high school match. It was the one that would set the tone for the rest of the season. The team was counting on him, and the pressure was mounting. His teammates were eager. The gym was filled with constant chatter about the game, and each practice felt more intense than the last. Marcus found himself pushing himself harder, determined to contribute to his team's success. But in the back of his mind, he kept wondering if he had what it took. The day before the game, Marcus woke up feeling sluggish. He had gone to bed late after finishing some last-minute study for his biology test, and he hadn't slept well. His body felt heavy, and his head was foggy. As the hours passed, it only seemed to get worse. During practice that afternoon, Marcus found himself struggling to keep up. His legs felt like lead, and his shots kept missing. He tried to push through it, but every part of him screamed that something was off. Coach Matthews pulled him aside during a break. "Marcus, what's going on? You don't look like yourself." Marcus shrugged, trying to play it cool. "I'm fine, coach. Just a little tired, that's all." Coach Matthews didn't buy it. He could see that Marcus was pushing himself too hard. "Listen, I know you're excited for tomorrow, but you need to rest. Your body's telling you it needs a break. Take it easy tonight and get some sleep." Marcus hesitated, his competitive nature kicking in. "I can't afford to rest, coach. This game is important. I can't let the team down." "I get it, but you won't be any good tomorrow if you don't take care of yourself today. Rest. You've worked hard enough. Don't burn yourself out now." Reluctantly, Marcus agreed. That night, he made a conscious effort to put his schoolwork aside and focus on relaxation. He ate a light dinner and went to bed early, hoping that the rest would be enough to recharge his body and mind. The next morning, Marcus woke up feeling a little better. His body still felt sore, but the fog in his head had lifted, and his energy had returned. The game was only a few hours away, and as he got dressed in his jersey, he couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. This was his moment. He met up with his teammates in the locker room before the game. There was a quiet tension in the air. They all knew what was at stake. Coach Matthews gathered them together for a brief pep talk. "All right, guys," Coach began, "this is the game we've been working for. It's not just about talent, it's about heart, teamwork, and sticking together when things get tough. Marcus, I know you're ready, and I've seen how hard you've worked. Now it's time to show everyone what we're made of." Marcus felt a wave of motivation wash over him. He wasn't just playing for himself, he was playing for his teammates, for Coach Matthews, and for everyone who believed in him. It was a feeling unlike any other. As the game started, Marcus could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The crowd was roaring, and the atmosphere was electric. It was the kind of energy that could either make or break. The first half was a blur of fast breaks, high-flying dunks, and intense defense. Marcus had been on point with his passes and had already made a couple of key shots. But something still felt off. He was pushing himself harder than ever, but he could sense that his body was starting to wear down again. At halftime, Coach Matthews gathered the team together. "You're doing great, but we need to finish strong. Marcus, you're looking good out there, but don't try to do it all by yourself. Trust your teammates, and let the game come to you." Marcus nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His body was telling him to slow down, but the intensity of the game made it hard to listen. He wanted to keep playing, keep pushing, keep proving that he could handle it all. As the second half began, things took a turn. Marcus was sprinting down the court when he felt a sharp pain in his side. It was the kind of pain that stopped him in his tracks. He tried to shake it off, but the pain only intensified with every movement. Coach Matthews noticed right away and called a timeout. He rushed over to Marcus, concern written all over his face. "Marcus, what's going on? You hurt?" "I'm fine, Coach," Marcus lied through gritted teeth. "Just a cramp. I'll be okay." But Coach wasn't convinced. "No, Marcus. If you push through this, you could hurt yourself worse. I need you to listen to me now. We've got a team, and we'll get through this together. Sit out for a bit and let us handle it." For a moment, Marcus felt a wave of frustration. He didn't want to sit out, not in the middle of such an important game. But Coach's words sank in. This wasn't just about him, it was about the team. And right now, the team needed him to be at his best. With a heavy heart, Marcus stepped off the court and sat down on the bench. His body was begging for rest, and he knew Coach was right. The team could carry the load for a while. Marcus watched from the bench as his teammates stepped up. For the first time all season, he wasn't the center of attention. But to his surprise, the team didn't miss a beat. They worked together seamlessly, making play after play, keeping the pressure on the other team. As the game clock wound down, the score was neck and neck. Marcus couldn't sit still, his heart racing with the fear that his team might lose without him. But then, something incredible happened. His teammate, Jake, made a clutch three-pointer in the final seconds, securing the win. The buzzer sounded, and the gym erupted into cheers. Marcus jumped to his feet, his pain momentarily forgotten as he joined his teammates in celebration. He had wanted to be the hero, but in the end, it wasn't about one player, it was about the team. As Marcus walked off the court, Coach Matthews clapped him on the back. "You did good, Marcus. You trusted your teammates, and that's what made the difference." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a sense of relief. He hadn't been the star player, but he had learned an important lesson: he didn't have to do it all by himself. And sometimes, stepping back and letting others step up was the most important thing he could do. With the victory of the game behind him, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't experienced in a long time. But as the days passed, it became clear that his journey was far from over. The intensity of the season had only just begun, and the pressure of balancing his schoolwork, basketball, and personal life was beginning to creep back into his mind. It was the morning after the game, and Marcus was feeling the effects of both his physical exertion and the emotional highs of victory. His muscles ached, his mind felt foggy, and his sense of balance, though temporarily restored, was beginning to falter again. That morning, when he checked his phone, there was a new message from his biology teacher. "Marcus, I noticed you didn't turn in your project last week. This is the final warning. If I don't see it by tomorrow, you'll fail the assignment." Marcus's heart sank. He had completely forgotten about the biology project. In the whirlwind of practices, games, and tutoring, he had let one important thing slip through the cracks. The project had been due the same day as the game, and in his effort to prioritize basketball, he had neglected his school responsibilities. He quickly opened the file on his phone, seeing that it was a detailed research paper on a complex topic about genetics, something he had not even started yet. The panic began to set in. There was no way he could finish it in time, not with the busy week ahead. As he stared at the deadline, the weight of his situation hit him all over again. His life was a delicate balancing act, and it felt like everything was on the verge of falling apart once more. Marcus knew he couldn't do this on his own. With the clock ticking, he texted his friend, Jake, who had been a big help during the game. Jake was one of the smartest people Marcus knew, always organized and ahead of the curve when it came to schoolwork. He needed advice, and fast. "Hey, Jake, I'm in a bind. Got a last-minute biology project, and I don't know where to start. You think you can help me out?" Jake responded almost immediately. "Sure thing. Meet me at lunch. I've got some tips for you." Grateful, Marcus replied, "Thanks, man. I'll see you then." At lunch, Marcus met up with Jake, who already had a plan in mind. "All right," Jake said, spreading out his notes on the table, "we need to break this down. Genetics is a huge topic, but if we focus on the key points, you can get a solid project done in time." Marcus felt a sense of relief as Jake went over the project's requirements. Jake was quick, efficient, and had a way of explaining things that made even the most complicated material seem simple. Marcus listened intently, taking notes and jotting down important details. They worked through the lunch hour, and by the end, Marcus had a clear plan of attack. "Thanks, Jake," Marcus said, his nerves easing. "You saved me, man." Jake smiled. "Don't mention it. Just don't forget about us next time." That evening, as Marcus sat in his room, working on the project, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. In the past few weeks, he had been on an emotional roller coaster, feeling the weight of his responsibilities, his failures, and his triumphs. But now, as he worked through the biology assignment, he realized something important. It wasn't just the tasks themselves that weighed on him, it was the pressure he put on himself to be perfect at everything. In the past, Marcus had tried to do it all alone. He'd struggled with the idea that asking for help meant he wasn't strong enough. But now, he was learning that strength didn't always mean doing everything by yourself. It meant knowing when to reach out, when to lean on others, and when to take a step back and prioritize. He looked at the clock. It was late, but the project was almost done. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be good enough. And that was something he could be proud of. As he typed out the last few sentences of his report, Marcus realized that the key to his success wasn't just about getting everything right. It was about making progress and finding the right balance. The next day, Marcus turned in his project with only a few hours to spare before the deadline. He wasn't sure if it would be enough to get him the grade he wanted, but at least he had done his best. For the first time in a while, he felt like he was taking control of his life again, not by doing everything on his own, but by asking for help when he needed it. Later that day, as he walked into the gym for practice, Coach Matthews pulled him aside. "Marcus," he began, "I just want to say, you've really stepped up this season. I've seen you grow not only as a player but also as a leader. You've been pushing yourself hard, and it's paying off, but I also see how much you've learned about working with the team. You're not carrying all the weight anymore. You're sharing it, and that's what makes you great." Marcus felt a wave of pride wash over him. It wasn't just his basketball skills that had improved, it was his understanding of what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. "Thanks, Coach," Marcus said, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's been a tough road, but I think I'm starting to get it." As the days passed, Marcus continued to refine his balance. With Jake's help, he turned in his biology project and received a solid grade, which helped boost his confidence. But more importantly, he began to realize that his journey was not just about his individual success, it was about learning to work with others, to trust in the people around him, and to take care of himself along the way. When the next game came around, Marcus played better than ever. He was no longer focused on being the star, instead, he was focused on playing as part of a team. His teammates noticed the change in him, he was more calm, more patient, and more willing to share the ball. The team played with more fluidity, and the chemistry between the players was stronger than ever. That night, after the game, Marcus sat in the locker room, exhausted but content. The victory felt different this time. It wasn't just about winning, it was about growth, about learning to be a better person, a better player, and a better teammate. The days following the game victory were both exhilarating and exhausting. Marcus had learned a lot about himself, but the challenges weren't over. The next few weeks of his senior year would test his limits in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had one victory under his belt, but he knew that balancing everything, basketball, school, and personal life, was an ongoing battle. It was early morning when Marcus woke up to his phone buzzing incessantly. Half awake, he reached for it and saw a text from Coach Matthews, "Team meeting at 7 a.m. Don't be late." Groaning, Marcus threw the covers off and reluctantly dragged himself out of bed. His muscles ached from the previous night's practice, and the thought of another day filled with non-stop work made him want to crawl back into bed. But he couldn't. His responsibilities were mounting, and there was no avoiding them. He quickly dressed in his gym clothes, grabbed a quick breakfast, and headed out to meet the team. The cold morning air hit his face as he made his way to the gym, his breath visible in the early morning light. As the team gathered in the locker room, the mood was somber. Coach Matthews walked in, looking as serious as Marcus had ever seen him. He stood in front of the team, his eyes scanning each player. "We've been doing great so far, but I need to be honest with you guys," Coach began, his tone heavy. "We've got some big games coming up, games that could make or break our season. We need to be at our best. No distractions, no excuses." "Marcus," he said, turning to Marcus, "I know you've been under a lot of pressure with school and everything, but you need to focus. The team is counting on you." Marcus swallowed hard. He hadn't realized just how much pressure had been building. It wasn't just about his basketball skills anymore, it was about his leadership, his ability to handle the weight of everyone's expectations. "I got it, Coach," Marcus said, though inside, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to take on this responsibility. But one thing was for sure, he had no choice. As the day wore on, Marcus tried his best to juggle his schoolwork with his basketball commitments, but it was becoming clear that something had to give. His biology project, though completed, was just the tip of the iceberg. He still had upcoming tests to study for, assignments to complete, and practices to attend. Each day felt like a constant race against time. He spent hours in the library after school, trying to catch up on missed assignments, while also managing to squeeze in a few shots at the gym. His mind was a blur, he was tired, stretched thin, and beginning to lose confidence in his ability to keep it all together. One evening, after another exhausting practice, Marcus returned home to an empty house. His mom had to work late, and his younger sister was at a friend's house. It was quiet, too quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. He couldn't do this on his own anymore. That's when he remembered the support from his friends, Jake, Sarah, and even Coach Matthews. They had been there for him when he needed them most, so why couldn't he turn to them again? He reached for his phone and sent a quick text to Sarah, "I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. Can we talk tonight?" Sarah replied almost immediately, "Of course, anytime. You okay?" Marcus smiled at the message, knowing that Sarah would understand. She was always there when he needed someone to talk to, and he trusted her more than anyone else. That evening, they met at a local coffee shop. The warm, inviting atmosphere was just what Marcus needed to feel a little less burdened. As they sat down with their drinks, Sarah immediately sensed that something was off. "You look tired," she said, her brow furrowing with concern. "What's going on? You've been pushing yourself too hard, haven't you?" Marcus sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I don't know how to balance everything, Sarah. I thought I could handle it, basketball, school, everything. But I feel like I'm falling behind. Every time I catch up on one thing, something else falls apart." Sarah took a sip of her coffee before responding. "Marcus, you don't have to do this alone. I know you're proud and want to handle things yourself, but you have to be willing to ask for help when you need it. You've got a whole team, not just on the court, but in life. People want to support you." Her words hit him hard. He had been so focused on proving himself that he hadn't realized how much help he could receive. The idea of leaning on others, especially when it came to schoolwork and personal struggles, was something he had always been reluctant to accept. But now, it felt like a relief to know that he didn't have to do it all on his own. "I guess I've been too hard on myself," he admitted, feeling vulnerable for the first time in a while. "I've been trying to live up to everyone's expectations, coaches, my teammates, even my own. And it's just a lot." Sarah smiled softly. "Marcus, you don't have to carry all that weight. You're human, just like everyone else. You're allowed to ask for help. Let your team, both on and off the court, be there for you." The conversation with Sarah marked a turning point for Marcus. As the days passed, he began to make small but meaningful changes. He reached out to Jake for help with his studies and asked his teammates for advice on how to manage his stress. He even allowed himself to take a break when he needed it, whether that meant skipping a few shots in practice or simply relaxing at home. When he returned to practice the next day, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. He was part of a team, on and off the court, and that made all the difference. The day of the next big game arrived, and the atmosphere was tense. The team had been preparing for weeks, and there was no room for error. The stakes were high, and Coach Matthews had made it clear that this game could define the season. But Marcus felt a sense of calm that had eluded him in the past. He had learned to lean on his teammates, to trust in his own abilities, and to ask for help when needed. He was ready, not just for the game, but for whatever came next. As the game kicked off, Marcus felt every ounce of energy surge through him. He wasn't just playing for the win, he was playing for something bigger, his team, his friends, and himself. The game was intense. Every point mattered, every play felt like a do-or-die situation. But Marcus played with focus, not because he had to be the hero, but because he knew his teammates had his back. With just seconds left in the game, the score was tied. The tension in the gym was palpable. Marcus had the ball, and the team relied on him to make the final shot. He looked to his teammates for support, and as he prepared to take the shot, he felt something new, a sense of confidence that came from knowing he wasn't alone. He took the shot. The ball soared through the air, and the buzzer rang. It was good. The team erupted in celebration. Marcus had hit the game winner, but more than that, he had learned that true strength came not just from within, but from the people who had supported him along the way. After the win, the team was riding high, their spirits lifted by Marcus's game-winning shot. The victory felt like a turning point, not just for the team, but for Marcus personally. He was learning to manage the pressures of school, basketball, and life, but just as he felt like he was getting his balance back, another challenge appeared on the horizon. The next morning, Marcus sat at his desk, poring over his calculus homework. He'd been focusing so much on basketball lately that school had taken a back seat. The pressure was starting to build again as he tried to stay on top of his assignments. He glanced at his phone when it buzzed with a message from Jake. "Yo, have you heard about the new kid?" Marcus frowned, typing back quickly. "What new kid?" "Some transfer from a private school. Coach has been talking about him. Word is, he's a beast on the court." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The idea of a new player coming in was exciting, but also terrifying. Would this new player threaten his place on the team? Would he be better, faster, stronger? It wasn't the thought of competition that unsettled Marcus, it was the idea that someone could come in and steal the spotlight just when he was beginning to find his rhythm. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Marcus couldn't focus on anything but the new player. By the time he reached the gym for practice that afternoon, his mind was racing. The gym was filled with the sound of basketballs bouncing and sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Coach Matthews was at the center, talking to the team, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty gnawing at him. Then he saw him. The new kid. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, 5 inches, and his build was lean but muscular. His skin was a deep shade of brown, his hair short and neat, and there was a quiet confidence about him that immediately stood out. He was shooting around, sinking shots from the three-point line like it was nothing. His form was flawless, and there was a fluidity to his movements that impressed even Marcus, who was known for his own skills on the court. As Coach Matthews called the team together, he motioned for the new player to step forward. "All right, boys, this is Chris. He's transferring in from St. John's Prep, and he's going to be a big part of the team from here on out. I expect all of you to welcome him and work together as a unit. We've got a long season ahead." Marcus's stomach twisted. Chris seemed like the kind of player who could take the team to the next level, but would that mean Marcus had to take a back seat? The idea of sharing the spotlight was hard to swallow. Basketball had always been Marcus's thing, and now, with this new player in the mix, he wasn't so sure where he fit. Coach Matthews decided to throw Chris into the mix right away. He set up a scrimmage to see how the team would gel with the new player. Marcus was paired up with Chris for the first few drills, and the instant they started working together, Marcus felt it. The competition. Chris was good, really good, and he wasn't afraid to show it. Chris drove past Marcus with ease, his speed and agility catching him off guard. On defense, Chris's quick reflexes and strategic positioning made it difficult for Marcus to find an opening. Every time Marcus made a move, Chris seemed one step ahead. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt insecure about his place on the team. The rivalry between him and Chris was undeniable, and it was only just beginning. As practice continued, the tension between Marcus and Chris grew. It wasn't just on the court, off the court, the team could feel it too. The other players were starting to pick up on the subtle rivalry, and some were already picking sides. At lunch the next day, Jake leaned in and whispered to Marcus, "You good, man? I can tell something's off. You've been quiet all day." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stirred his salad absent-mindedly, trying to collect his thoughts. "I don't know, man. I've been thinking about Chris. He's good, right? Better than I thought." Jake nodded. "Yeah, he's good. But that doesn't mean you're out of the picture. You're still one of the best on this team. You've worked too hard to let someone else come in and take your spot." Marcus's mind raced. Jake's words rang true, but the doubt still lingered. Was he good enough? Did he have what it took to keep up with Chris's talent, or was he just a player who had reached his peak? Later that day, Coach Matthews pulled Marcus aside after practice. He had a stern look on his face, something that Marcus hadn't seen in a while. "Marcus, we need to talk." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. Was he in trouble? Was he losing his edge? He followed Coach to the office and sat down. "Look," Coach began, "I know you've been feeling a little off lately, especially with Chris coming in. I see the way you're reacting, and I want to make sure you're not letting this rivalry get in your head." Marcus didn't know how to respond. He had been feeling the pressure, but admitting it felt strange. "Marcus," Coach continued, "Chris is a great player, and he's going to push you, but that doesn't change who you are. I've seen your growth this season, and it's not about one player coming in and taking your place. It's about the team, about all of you working together to get to the next level." Marcus looked down at the floor, trying to process what Coach was saying. "But what if he's just better than me?" Coach Matthews leaned forward, his voice softening. "Marcus, don't let comparisons dictate your value. You bring something to this team that no one else can. You've worked hard for everything you've earned, and Chris's arrival isn't going to change that. Use this as fuel to push yourself harder, but don't forget, there's no I in team." Marcus sat in silence, absorbing Coach's words. He had been so focused on the idea of competition that he forgot what really mattered, teamwork. With the team fully aware of the rivalry between Marcus and Chris, tensions were running high. But something remarkable started happening over the next few weeks. Rather than dividing the team, the competition began to bring out the best in everyone. Marcus and Chris pushed each other to new limits, and the entire team seemed to thrive off the energy they were both generating. Every practice became more intense, every game more meaningful. But despite this, Marcus still couldn't shake the feeling that the pressure was starting to build too much. His mind was constantly torn between staying focused on the team's goals and proving to himself that he was still good enough to lead. The turning point came unexpectedly. It was a Wednesday afternoon practice, a few days before the team's biggest game of the season. Marcus was running drills with Chris, their competitive nature apparent in every movement they made. As he went up for a layup, Chris attempted to block the shot. It happened so quickly that Marcus barely had time to react. Chris's hand collided with his elbow midair. Marcus felt a sharp pain shoot through his arm as he landed awkwardly on the hardwood floor. The gym fell silent. Marcus grimaced, clutching his elbow in pain. The coaches and players rushed over, and the concern on their faces was immediate. "Marcus, you okay?" Jake called out from across the gym, his voice tinged with worry. "I'm fine. I think," Marcus replied, though the pain was still throbbing in his arm. The coaches huddled around him, trying to assess the injury. After a few moments of quiet discussion, Coach Matthews stood up and turned to Marcus. "We're going to get this checked out. We can't take any chances before the game." An hour later, Marcus sat in a sterile examination room at the local clinic, his arm wrapped in an ice pack. The doctor examined his elbow, poking and prodding in places that made Marcus wince. "I think it's just a bruise, maybe a minor strain," the doctor said, glancing at the X-ray. "But I'd recommend a few days of rest. You need to take it easy and avoid putting too much pressure on it." Marcus nodded, though his heart sank. He couldn't afford to miss a single day of practice, not with everything at stake. The team needed him. He needed to be ready for the game. "Can I play this weekend?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. The doctor hesitated before answering. "You're going to need to rest, but I'll leave that up to your coach. If you push it too soon, you risk making it worse." The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Marcus sat on the sidelines at practice, watching his teammates run drills without him. His mind raced with frustration. He hated not being in control. His competitive drive demanded that he be on the court, pushing himself and leading his team. But deep down, he knew that if he didn't take care of himself, he could jeopardize not just the season, but his future. Chris, seeing Marcus struggling, approached him during a break. "Hey, you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I didn't mean to hurt you out there." Marcus looked at him, still feeling a flicker of animosity. But something in Chris's eyes made him soften. "I know you didn't mean to. I'm just frustrated, you know. I hate sitting out when the team needs me." Chris nodded. "I get it. But you'll be back out there soon. Just don't rush it. You've got the team's back, and we've got yours." For a moment, Marcus felt a strange sense of camaraderie with Chris, something he hadn't expected. Maybe the rivalry didn't have to define them. Maybe it could be the fire that made them both better. As the weekend game drew closer, Marcus wrestled with the idea of playing. His elbow still hurt, but the pain was becoming more bearable. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he didn't want to let his team down. Coach Matthews had been adamant that Marcus rest, but Marcus knew he had to be out there. The morning of the game, Marcus went to Coach's office to have one last conversation. "I think I'm good to go, Coach," Marcus said, looking him in the eye. "I can play today. I don't want to let the team down." Coach Matthews studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You've come a long way, Marcus. But I need you to promise me something. If you start feeling that pain again, I want you to come out. Don't risk it." "I promise," Marcus said, swallowing the lump in his throat. The atmosphere in the gym was electric as the crowd buzzed with anticipation. The team had been preparing for this game for weeks. This was the one that could make or break their season. It was the final game before the playoffs, and every point mattered. Marcus stood at the edge of the court, his muscles tense, his elbow still wrapped, but not as painful as it had been. His teammates gave him supportive pats on the back as they warmed up. Even Chris, despite the rivalry, gave him a thumbs up. As the game tipped off, Marcus felt his adrenaline kick in. The first few minutes felt almost surreal. His mind was in a state of hyperfocus. But with every play, his elbow reminded him of the injury, just a dull throb, but it was enough to make him cautious. He pushed through, staying in the game, knowing that he had to prove himself. The game was intense. The opposing team was fast and skilled, and it quickly became clear that they were not going to give up without a fight. Marcus found himself at the center of the action, his competitiveness pushing him past the pain in his elbow. He wasn't going to hold back, not now, not when everything was on the line. With just seconds left in the game, the score was tied. The entire gym seemed to hold its breath as Marcus dribbled the ball up the court. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind was calm. The final shot was in his hands. Marcus glanced at Chris, who was positioned at the three-point line, ready for the pass. But for a split second, Marcus hesitated. The team needed him to make this play. He took a deep breath, thinking of everything that had led him here, the struggle, the pain, the doubts. This was his moment. With a swift motion, Marcus dribbled to the basket, faked left, and went up for a layup. The defense closed in on him, but Marcus's instincts kicked in. He felt the ball leave his fingertips and watched as it soared through the air, right into the hoop. The buzzer sounded. The gym erupted. The weeks following the big game were a whirlwind for Marcus and the entire team. The victory had propelled them into the playoffs, but the pressure wasn't letting up. Every opponent they faced seemed tougher than the last, and the stakes kept rising. Marcus had learned a lot about his limits, his teammates, and himself, but now, as the competition intensified, it became clear that they were about to face their greatest challenge yet. It was a few days before their next game, and the team was gearing up for the biggest match of the season. The energy in the locker room was palpable. Everyone was focused, but there was an underlying sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. Marcus had found a new rhythm. The tension with Chris had dissolved, replaced by a mutual understanding and respect. They were both key players, but their shared goals had started to outweigh their individual desires for glory. They were playing as a team now. Each pass, each shot, each defensive play was a reflection of their growth. "I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to crush this," Jake said, slapping his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Yeah, we've worked too hard to let this slip away," Marcus replied, his voice steady. He had been nervous at first, unsure of how he would handle the mounting pressure. But now, with his teammates around him, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Chris, who had been quiet in the corner, stood up and addressed the team. "This is it. We've come so far. It's time to show everyone what we're made of." The team erupted into applause, and for the first time, Marcus felt the weight of the moment, not just as an individual, but as a part of something greater than himself. Their next opponent was a well-known powerhouse, one that had dominated the league for years. The City High Ravens were legendary, and their star player, Marcus's former rival, Derek, had been the talk of the season. Derek was fast, skilled, and ruthless on the court. He was the type of player who thrived under pressure, and Marcus had faced him before. They had clashed in a couple of youth league games, and Derek had always gotten the better of him. Now, with the playoffs on the line, Marcus knew this would be the ultimate test. Derek was a force, but Marcus wasn't the same player he had been the last time they faced off. He had grown, mentally, physically, and emotionally. The night before the game, Marcus lay in bed, his mind racing. He thought about Derek, about their past rivalry, about everything that had led him to this point. He had so many reasons to want to win, but it wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about proving to his teammates that they could rely on him. It was about showing them that the strength of the team was greater than the sum of its parts. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "This is my moment," he thought. "And I'm not letting it slip away." The gym was packed, the stands overflowing with fans, parents, and students all cheering for their respective teams. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the kind of energy that only a playoff game could bring. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the team made their way onto the court. The Ravens were already there, warming up with their usual cocky swagger. Derek was the first to meet their eyes, his glare as sharp as ever. "Ready to lose, Marcus?" Derek taunted as he jogged by. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't have to. He had moved past the old rivalry. Now, he just had one goal: win for the team. As the game began, it was clear that this would be a fight. The Ravens were aggressive, pushing the tempo and testing their defense at every turn. Derek came out strong, hitting a three-pointer on the very first play. The crowd went wild, and Marcus's heart raced. But instead of getting rattled, Marcus took a deep breath and focused. He wasn't going to let Derek's trash talk or the crowd's energy get to him. The first quarter was a back-and-forth battle, with both teams exchanging baskets. Marcus and Chris worked well together, moving the ball with precision, setting screens, and creating open shots. But the Ravens weren't backing down. Derek continued to dominate the floor, hitting shots from every angle, and his speed was unmatched. With the second quarter winding down, the game was tied. But Marcus could feel his team tiring, and Derek was starting to heat up. They needed a spark. That's when Marcus took matters into his own hands. With just seconds left on the clock, he stole the ball from Derek at the top of the key. He dribbled quickly down the court, eyes scanning for an open man. As he approached the basket, he faked left and took a quick step right, driving past two defenders. Derek was closing in fast, but Marcus didn't hesitate. With a quick jump, he launched himself toward the hoop, releasing the ball just as Derek leaped to block it. The ball sailed through the air and, swish, it dropped cleanly into the net. The crowd erupted into cheers, and the team went wild. Marcus stood for a moment, feeling the adrenaline surge through his veins. He had just given his team the lead at the buzzer, and he could feel the momentum shifting in their favor. But the game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the final quarter, the Ravens came out hard, desperate to regain the lead. Derek was relentless, attacking the basket with everything he had. But Marcus had learned how to handle his rival's intensity. He stayed close, defended hard, and made sure the team kept their composure. With only a minute left in the game, the Ravens had narrowed the gap. The score was tied, and Marcus knew the next play could decide it all. The ball was in his hands. He looked to his teammates, who were all positioning themselves, ready to move. "Take it," Chris said, nodding toward Marcus. "We believe in you." Marcus gave a quick nod in return. He had to make this count. He dribbled slowly, drawing Derek out to the perimeter. The clock was ticking down, 10, 9, 8. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was playing for his team, for everything they had fought for. As Derek lunged at him, Marcus made his move. He faked left, then quickly spun right, using his speed to drive past him. The basket was in sight. With just seconds left on the clock, Marcus went up for the shot. The defenders crashed into him as he released the ball, but it didn't matter. The shot was true. Swish. The buzzer sounded. The air felt thicker as the championship game loomed closer. After the hard-fought victory against the City High Ravens, Marcus and his teammates had earned their spot in the final game of the season. It was the culmination of everything they had worked for, the early mornings, the grueling practices, the setbacks, and the triumphs. But as much as they had accomplished, they knew that this next game would define everything. The stadium where the championship would be held was packed to capacity. The fans were loud, their energy palpable as they cheered for their respective teams. But for Marcus, it wasn't just the crowd that made this game feel different. It was the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a game. This was everything. Their opponents, the Westside Warriors, were a team that had dominated the league for the past 5 years. They were fast, they were talented, and they were led by their star player, Malik Thomas. Malik was a beast on the court, unstoppable, unpredictable, and aggressive. He had single-handedly led his team to numerous victories, and the pressure was on for him to deliver another championship. Malik and Marcus had never faced each other directly in a high-stakes game like this, but Marcus had watched Malik play for years. He was good, really good. And Marcus knew that if they were going to win, they had to stop him. But stopping Malik wasn't going to be easy. The Warriors were a well-coached team with a proven track record. It would take everything Marcus and his teammates had to come out on top. In the locker room, Coach Matthews gave his final pep talk before the game. "This is what we've been working for," he said, his voice calm but full of intensity. "You've already proven you're a team. Now go out there and show the world what you're made of. Play as one. Play for each other." The words struck Marcus deep. For so long, he had thought this game was about proving himself, about showing everyone that he could lead. But now, it wasn't about him. It was about the team. The bond they had formed, the struggles they had overcome, and the trust they had built, it all led to this moment. They were a family, and this was their chance to prove it to the world. Marcus caught Chris's eye across the room. Chris gave him a knowing nod. They didn't need to say anything, their shared understanding said it all. They were ready. As the game began, it was clear that this was going to be a battle. The Warriors came out with all the intensity they were known for, but Marcus and his team matched their energy at every turn. The pace was fast, the shots were hard, and the crowd was on edge. Malik immediately showed why he was so dangerous. He hit a three-pointer on the first possession, and every time Marcus thought he had him figured out, Malik made a move that left him second-guessing. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He played aggressive defense, keeping Malik from driving the lane while also making sure he wasn't wide open for shots. He had to stay one step ahead, constantly adjusting his game to counter Malik's every move. The first quarter ended with the Warriors holding a slim lead, but Marcus could feel the energy of the game shifting in their favor. His teammates were in sync, and they were feeding off each other's energy. Chris had become a major threat on the outside, knocking down three-pointers, while Jake was dominating inside, grabbing rebounds and setting up screens. The team was playing like a well-oiled machine. In the second quarter, Marcus began to feel the pressure building again, a familiar knot in his stomach. The Warriors started to pull ahead, and Malik was starting to get into a rhythm. Marcus knew that if they were going to win, they needed to put together a run before halftime. That's when he made a decision. He would take the game into his own hands, just for a moment. With about 3 minutes left in the half, Marcus brought the ball down the court. The Warriors' defense was tight, but Marcus could see the openings. He faked right, drove left, and found himself with a clear path to the basket. He went up for the layup, but Malik was closing in fast. At the last second, Marcus passed the ball to Chris, who was wide open on the three-point line. Chris didn't hesitate. He let the ball fly. Swish. The crowd erupted into cheers as the ball sailed through the net. The team had their momentum back. But the best part was seeing how the Warriors reacted. Malik, who had been so confident just moments ago, now had a look of uncertainty in his eyes. They weren't just beating him, they were making him question everything he thought he knew. The game was far from over, though. The Warriors came out of halftime with a renewed sense of urgency. Malik was relentless, pushing harder and harder. But Marcus wasn't backing down. Every time Malik hit a shot, Marcus responded. And every time Marcus made a play, the team backed him up. It was a beautiful exchange, both teams were playing at the highest level possible. As the game entered the final few minutes, it was anyone's game. The score was tied, and the tension in the gym was palpable. Marcus had the ball, and the clock was winding down. There were only 15 seconds left on the game clock, and everything rested on this play. He dribbled at the top of the key, looking for an opening. Malik was guarding him closely, but Marcus wasn't worried. He had been through too much to be intimidated now. He had learned how to trust his teammates, and that's exactly what he did. With just 5 seconds left, Marcus made a quick move, pulling Malik out of position. He passed the ball to Chris, who was open at the arc. Time seemed to slow as Chris lined up the shot. The ball left Chris's hands, soaring toward the hoop. The stadium was silent as it traveled through the air. Everything else seemed to fade away, Marcus, the team, the fans, Malik, it was just Chris and the basket. Swish. The crowd exploded into a frenzy as the buzzer sounded. The team had won. Marcus couldn't believe it. He ran to Chris, who was already being swarmed by the rest of the team. They were champions. In the midst of the celebration, Marcus took a moment to step back. He looked around at his teammates, who were shouting, hugging, and celebrating their victory. They had done it. They had achieved what everyone said was impossible. Coach Matthews approached him, a proud smile on his face. "You did it, Marcus. You led this team. And you showed them what it means to be a true champion." Marcus smiled, his heart full. This wasn't just about the trophy or the championship. It was about the journey they had been on together. The growth, the struggles, and the bond that had formed between them all. They had won because they had learned how to play as a team. As the team stood together on the podium, the championship trophy in their hands, Marcus realized that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was still full of challenges, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had a team that would always have his back, and together, they could accomplish anything. As the final whistle blew, signaling the end of their victorious season, Marcus looked at his teammates one last time. This was the moment he had always dreamed of, but now, it wasn't about individual success. It was about the friendships they had forged, the challenges they had overcome, and the lessons they had learned together. And with that, Marcus knew he was ready for whatever came next. Because this was not just the end of a season. It was the beginning of something even bigger. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?